Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Research Showcase. My name is Kinneret Gordon. I'm the lead research community officer on the Wikimedia Foundation's research team. Welcome to this month's Research Showcase. Our showcases are meant to recognize and share recent work on or relevant to the Wikimedia projects. For those of you that are joining us live, we welcome you to ask questions, as always, of the speakers in the YouTube chat. We will monitor these questions and pass the questions on to the speakers at the end of their presentation. And we kindly ask that everyone follow the friendly space policy and the universal code of conduct. Before we get started, I have just one very quick announcement. In August, or very soon, in about 2 weeks, we have Wikimania happening. It is August 6th through 9th in Nairobi, Kenya, and online. Registration for virtual tickets is free and is still open. I'll drop a link in the chat, and we hope to see you all there to discuss all things Wikimedia movement related. And with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague Diego, who will introduce this month's theme and speakers.
Thank you very much, Kinneret. Welcome, everybody. My name is Diego Strumper. I'm a senior research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation, and I'm super happy to be here and introduce you on hosting this July 2025 Research Showcase. The topic that we have for today is examining the impact of LLMs on knowledge production communities. And as you know, we run this showcase every month, and we plan the topics for the showcases with long time. But especially this topic is very timely because, as you may know, there's a lot of discussions around on how generative AI is being used and how it's affecting Wikipedia. Very recently, there were some communities like the Spanish and Japanese Wikipedias concerning about how newcomers are using generative AI. So how people that doesn't know how to write an article goes to generative AI and try to use that when they are starting to write on Wikipedia. And also in English Wikipedia, there has been a lot of discussion and concern with different potential uses of AI. The foundation, the Wikimedia Foundation, has been also experimenting with different models and different systems for understanding the impact of generative AI on wikis, and wanted to see also how we can use, or if we should use them in the Wikimedia environment. There has been several projects like the AI summaries or the tone check models and other tools that has gathered a lot of attention and some concerns from the movement, from the editors. So it's super important to discuss how LLMs are affecting our communities, because there are different point of view, there are different usage of AI, but one thing that we can all agree is that generative AI is already here and is affecting and interacting with all the internet, and that's not exclude Wikipedia. So that's why the topic for today is very, very relevant. And we have two very interesting talks that will discuss the impact of the generative AI or the LLMs on the in general in the internet, but also specifically on Wikipedia. So with that context, let me introduce our speaker for today. For the first talk, we have two speakers, the two authors of this paper, Kristen Brooks and Denis Peskov from Northwestern University, and they're going to talk about the rise of AI-generated content in Wikipedia. So Denis is a postdoctoral fellow in the Northwestern University working in human-centered natural language processing. And he has also previously done a postdoc at Princeton and his PhD in computer science at the University of Maryland. He enjoys using Wikipedia for double-checking algorithm runtimes and for learning the history of the cities while traveling. Dr. Kristen Brooks was formerly a master's student at Princeton University, where he also earned his undergrad degree in 2023. He's now working at a startup, and previously he has worked as an AI researcher in the Sentient Foundation. For the second talk, we have Gordon Bartsch from the Boston University. Gordon has published a lot of work in studying the usage of artificial intelligence and other related topics, and his work has been widely published, supported by over 2 million in grants and cited by various outlets in popular press, including the Time magazine, Wired, and the Wall Street Journal. In addition to his academic appointment, he had held position as consulting researcher with both Microsoft and Meta. It's important to emphasize that the work today is not affiliated with either organization. His talk will focus on the consequence of generative AI for online knowledge communities. Let me remember that after each talk, we'll have 10 minutes for discussions, and we are happy to take your questions in the YouTube chat. My colleague Deborah will be monitoring the chat and give the questions to the presenters. So with this context, I'm happy to introduce you, Kristen and Dennis. So please, Kristen and Dennis, go ahead. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having us here. So my name is Dennis Peskov, and I'm a postdoc at Northwestern. I did this work with Preston and Sam when we were all together at Princeton. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this paper came to be, as well as the role of Wikipedia in natural language processing more broadly. So believe it or not, natural language processing has been a field since before the era of large language models. And one of the core things, I've been involved in the field since 2016, and I think at the time everything really revolved around embeddings. So this was a concept that you could reduce language to a more quantified form. And as one illustrative example from Wikipedia, you can think of it as a chart that shows the distance between France relative to the word for Paris. And you can see that that distance is somewhat comparable to the distance between Germany and Berlin. And this really gives a quantitative mathematical representation to language, which allowed it to do a lot of clever things, which ultimately ended up in the large language model era that we are at today. And Wikipedia has always been an integral part of the research community in providing probably some of the highest quality, most publicly accessible data there is. So Word2Vec, Glove, Fast Text, BERT, these are all well-known phrases in the community that helped develop the field to where it is today. And all of those were trained on Wikipedia initially, along with some other sources. So basically, especially as an academic researcher, you sometimes don't really have that many funds to do your research. So Wikipedia has always been this available data set that you could try out research ideas on. And there's been more research that used it directly, not just for training embeddings, for example, for understanding entities and maybe events that happened from Wikipedia, for doing question answering, seeing what is a question, what types of questions you should be asking content about, for seeing how you can simplify text, for example, how you can rewrite something to be more easy to understand, and then also for studying word senses as well as more technical language. So all of these were uses that helped facilitate natural language processing, and we're using Wikipedia as its source data. And if it's not obvious to you, that last formatting from the last two slides came from GenAI itself, which was ChatGPT. So that's something that in the modern era, you can ask ChatGPT or some other tool to create. And there's a whole lot of different examples. So one of the core research questions I was interested in is how are people using GenAI and how is this ultimately going to change society? So these were examples. The left was my personal feed on Instagram, where I don't know what yours looks like, but there's a whole lot of videos and images that are sometimes paired with clearly GenAI generated content that describes the image or the video, and other times has nothing to do with it whatsoever. So I personally found that there's a lot more slop that exists on the internet where it's not personalized content. It's a lot of algorithm optimized content that's generated very quickly. And I suspect some of it gets a market and others doesn't, and then gets dropped. And then this was a popular Reddit post from this past month that had a lot of different, it just showed a menu that was translated most likely with GenAI. And I verified this where I asked ChatGPT to write out a definition of chicken pox, and it assumed I had mistyped chicken pox and described the virus. So if you were especially a non-native English speaker and you were using this for a quick translation and you didn't do any sort of quality assurance, then you could see how you could end up with something being a menu like this. And so ultimately, to contextualize this talk, GenAI depends on information, not just architecture. So we've made very rapid advancements in the field. There's obviously a whole lot of research and money going into developing the very best possible large language model architectures. But what that architecture ultimately tells you is still a fundamentally human question and will depend on communities. So if you ask ChatGPT where it gets its information, the very first source it will quote is Wikipedia. So it's been a very large part of the field historically. And for us, why we did this research project is because we think how Wikipedia is shaped in the future is going to shape a lot of sort of the information age. Now, Creston's going to talk about the details of how we did this research study, but we found that ultimately, like a lot of the stuff that we discovered through this was then being reviewed and caught by the verification community. So we think we found that Wikipedia does a very good job of doing this monitoring. And I think in the past year or so since we published this paper, we've seen how the policies of the Wikimedia Foundation has been quite encouraging of having some sort of human in the loop and some sort of verification, which is not necessarily the general trend in the world of AI. So we've been really excited to get some feedback from Wikipedia when we initially submitted this paper for the workshop, and we hope you'll like the results as well. So Creston, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. So as Dennis said, what initially instilled this curiosity in us to do this study is just that there's so much AI content taking over everything. And we're curious how things are affected, what it means for the things that are affected, and in particular for something like Wikipedia, which is such a common source of knowledge for everyone. And this leads to a question: how can you detect Gen AI? And it's a very tricky question, one that you have companies trying to solve and raising a lot of money to solve. Two, you have open source researchers trying to put out effective software. And we considered a bunch of options and ultimately settled on a couple that were scalable for our purposes. And we should say that we conducted this research now about a year ago. So the landscape has changed a lot since then, and we're hopeful that people will replicate this work and improve it as well. So the two Gen AI detectors that we consider are one on the left, GPT-0, which is a very common commercial AI detector. And on the right, two, binoculars, which is open source, just requires two models and a bit of clever math. We can go next slide. Yeah. So on the one hand, GPT-0 is proprietary. No one really knows how it works. But binoculars, we can maybe talk a little bit about how the intuition works for the score. Binoculars has two components, a numerator and a denominator. On the numerator, we have perplexity. And how this works is you have a bit of text and you ask an LLM, how normal do you think this text looks? And in general, if an LLM thinks that text looks pretty normal, if it thinks it's high chance, then this might be an indicator that it's LLM generated, because LLMs will think that the things they generate are likely because that's why they generated them in the first place. Even if it isn't the same LLM that generated the text, LLMs share a lot of the same training data, these billions and trillions of tokens they have in common. And on the bottom, the denominator, we have this term called cross perplexity, which means how do two different LLMs agree on a text token by token? I'll dive into this a bit more, but for now we can. Okay. So first of all, why is just perplexity not enough to detect AI? Why is just the numerator not enough? Well, you may have a situation where you're telling ChatGPT or a different LLM to have a very specific prompt that produces an output, and this output just on its own doesn't seem very likely. Say I took some LLM and I said, how likely do you think this sentence is? It would probably think some of these words are pretty weird and the likelihood would be low. So this isn't maybe a very good LLM generated text detector on its own. So this is why the bottom term is necessary, even if the text being considered is unlikely in a vacuum. If two separate LLMs think each word is similarly likely or unlikely, then this is maybe a smoking gun that it was generated by an LLM. And the intuition here is that LLMs will agree more on the tokens and the probabilities distributions for each of these tokens for LLM generated text rather than human, because they share so much of the same training data and their distributions are drawn from very similar data. Okay. So we have these two Gen AI detectors. We have this open source one, we have this closed source one. And now we want to see how much AI generated content we can find and what we can measure. But the problem is we don't have any ground truth on what is actually AI generated on Wikipedia, for example. We don't have a list of articles and we say, by the way, these are generated by AI, so you can use these to calibrate your thresholds. We don't have that. But what we do have is, conveniently, we have plenty of articles which we know to not be AI generated. And this is just the state of any article prior to the popularization of LLMs. For example, pre-March 2022, which was the release of GPT 3.5. So if you look at an article and it hasn't been touched since pre that date, you know it probably isn't infected by what we nowadays call AI-generated content. So what we do is we get articles from prior to March 2022. We actually don't look at articles with edit dates earlier than that. We use an online resource, which is a snapshot of articles from back then. And we run a bunch of articles through these different tools. And it should be noted that these tools, they don't output, yes, this is AI, no, this isn't AI. They just output a score between 0 and 1. So we can get a distribution of scores based on these articles from prior to March 2022 to get a sense of what kind of scores these, these tools are producing. And after we do that, we can look at the scores and pick a threshold such that 99% of articles from prior to March 2022 fall below this score. And the point of this is we can find a threshold that artificially calibrates a 1% false positive rate. So what this is say we have 5,000 articles from prior to March 2022. We can pick a score such that 99% of them will be lower than the score based on each of the AI detectors. And the hope is then that this same score can be extrapolated to apply to new articles. But there is a key assumption here in this extrapolation, and it's that we calibrate the score based on a distribution of pre-2022 articles. There is an assumption that this data distribution will be comparable to the data distribution which we consider in 2024. In particular, in our study, we consider August 2024 articles. There's an assumption that with respect to the features that these AI detectors are sensitive to, that the only thing that has changed in these distributions are AI use itself. For example, there could be a confounder that leads to scores changing, but say AI detectors were just really, really sensitive to someone using a word that became more popular in 2024 than in 2022. This could be a confounder. So we consider some of these, and we'll talk about them. One potential confounder that may affect these detectors is how polished are the articles. For example, say we're considering an article from 2022 that's been around a long time and it's seen a lot of edits and its phrasing is very polished in comparison to an article that was just created in August 2024. This might be a difference in distribution. So we consider what this might look like. And we actually find this doesn't seem to be a problem. We find that for the pre-2022 articles, the more polished ones actually get higher GPT scores. So it would be a problem if this was the reverse. So this seems okay. We consider another confounder, which is what if these pre-2022 articles were present in the training data of whatever detectors we're considering or whatever LLMs they're based on, which they certainly were part of this training data. Would this not be a confounder? And this is a very important one to consider. And it seems as well that at least for binoculars, asterisk here, because we actually don't know how GPT-0 works, but at least for binoculars, this wouldn't be a problem. If you consider the binocular score that we talked about earlier, if an article was in training data, it would actually make the score for that article lower. If you, the numerator, the perplexity of an article, if that was in training data, then an LLM would consider it very likely because that was in its training data. And similarly, so that would be a low perplexity on the numerator. And in the denominator, it would be a very high cross perplexity as well. The two LLMs would very highly agree on the words in this text because they've both seen them during training. But if they, back a slide real quick. But if you consider an article that was created in 2024 that's never been seen in training, then it wouldn't benefit from this boost. So this as well is not a problem for us. If anything, it will make the lower bounds a bit lower than maybe they should be. So these are just two confounders we consider. We talk about a couple more in the paper. There certainly are others, and this assumption can't be completely watertight, but hopefully future research as well can continue to minimize such confounders. Okay, so what we have in the end then is with thresholds calibrated from 2022 articles, we apply these same thresholds to articles that were created in August 2024. And we can see what percent of those articles are above the threshold for 2024 rather than 2022. And we study English, we study a few other languages. It should be noted that this is mainly exploratory. The AI detectors that we consider are really only meant for English. So this will lead to higher false negative rates, many probably AI generated things slipping through the cracks in these languages potentially. So this is a good area for further research. We include it to get the ball rolling mainly. And we find, at least in English, for GPT-0, in the 2024 articles, about a 5% of those articles are above our calibrated threshold relative to the 1% above that threshold for the pre-2022 articles. 5.24 or so minus 1 equals 4.24 or so, as our lower bound estimate for the GPT-0 scored number of articles that were created in August 2024 that are likely to have some AI-generated content. And after doing so, we wanted to go through and take a look at what these articles looked like, the ones that were flagged by both tools, to try to see how do these look, why do we think people are using AI tools? And we found some interesting things. One, we found a pattern of people that seemingly use AI for some maybe politically motivated agenda. One example here, you can see an edit history of someone being very active in wars involving Albania, changing results from mixed result to victory on different pages and creating brand new pages for new Albanian victories. This was interesting. Slide. We found people that seemingly were making advertisements, Wikipedia pages, just to show, hey, this is my restaurant. Hey, this is my business. One example was a Wikipedia article for some house in England, and that had been put up for sale a couple weeks prior. So you can see people interested, maybe giving some authenticity to their whatever they're selling by making a Wikipedia page. In addition to, I won't dive too deeply into this, but we did a similar study on a couple other data sources to see how how the same state of affairs looked in other fora. And we looked at Reddit, we looked at contentious subreddits, political debates, places where people try to convince each other of their own political argument and have longer comments. We also looked at different United Nations country teams' press releases. And we find some interesting results here as well. On Reddit, people don't seem to be using as much AI-generated content for the comments, at least not that we can detect. In the United Nations country teams, there actually is a large amount. But if you're interested in this, I'll let you check out the paper for more details there. Yeah, so thank you. Looking forward to any questions, anything we can clarify. One, as Dennis said, when we did this study, we consider new articles that were created in August 2024, and we evaluated these as well, like at the very end of August 2024. So these are articles that were created within that month, and many of them were receiving ongoing moderation, and we saw that a lot of these already were flagged by some sort of warning, some sort of cleanup. So it seems like Wikipedia is doing a really great job at finding these. I'm personally curious how they're doing that. And things must have changed a lot in the last year. So hopefully we see more work into this. I should finally say as well that when we did this, we we were grateful to have funding and could pay to use GPT-0 API. We found out since that it seems like they offer free credits for researchers. So I encourage anyone who wants to replicate this kind of work, do their own work on AI detection, to reach out to GPT-0 and request research credits. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, both. This was super interesting. We have some questions from the room. I have a question. Martin, do you have a question too? Do you want to start? Please.
Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I have a question about to kind of interpret a little bit the number about 5% or so. It was in English Wikipedia that you said had AI generated content. Can you say something about kind of the extent of AI generation in these articles that you consider AI generated? Because I would assume, I don't know, I haven't worked with these tools, that there's a big spectrum for, I asked the LLM to generate the article and I put that on Wikipedia. Probably, I assume that's not something we would want or the community want, versus I use an LLM or one of these tools to do spell checking, and then maybe they contain very specific wordings, which maybe gets flagged by these tools, which have been reported in the context of papers. But that's maybe not something that's so bad if people actually use these tools for spell checking. So that's why I'm thinking just like this, yes, no, it has AI generated content. I think there's a spectrum of what that actually means. I don't know if you can say anything about that, even if it's qualitative or you just speculate. I'd be very interested to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we use GPT-0, the score that we use to determine the threshold is their score for what is the probability that this article is completely AI generated. But note, like, that's just a number, and we calibrate the threshold based on 99% of the pre-2022 articles falling below it. So it's maybe like you can't be obviously interpreted, but empirically looking at the articles that were flagged by this threshold, I think we see a mix. Some are very obviously just copy pasted from ChatGPT, and then others are, like you said, seem to be benign and maybe using an LLM as a translation. There were some instances that we found of an author who had gotten, I think, several articles rejected in the past by moderators for the writing quality, the English quality not being high enough, and then subsequently maybe using LLM to fix grammar, fix English. So there are certainly cases which are more benign than others, and we saw both in the sweep of results there.
And one other decision point is we saw an example of machine translation being used. So you could create articles in underrepresented languages, and whether that is like something that Wikipedia wants to encourage or discourage, I think is going to be a decision point by the community.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the questions, and Christian and this for the answers. I think we have time for one question. There's some questions from YouTube. Do you want to pass one of them?
I'll voice one of the questions from YouTube. So there was a comment about how it would be interesting to see how much is detected as AI-generated content on Swedish Wikipedia. And the person's guess is that it would be many false positives due to the large amount of non-AI bot-generated content that they guess the LLMs have been trained on. Isaac chimed in to say that perhaps because that's highly consistent and probably recognizable language, and that could be interesting to check. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on that? Or Isaac, if you also want to chime in with what your thinking was on that question. But yeah, speakers, go ahead.
What I would just say is, yeah, that certainly would be interesting to see. say that prior to 2022, there was a similar amount of maybe Swedish bot usage as there was in the, say, 2024 articles, then what we would presume would be that the thresholds calibrated to induce only a 1% false positive rate on the 2022 articles would extrapolate to the 2024. So these sort of like bot signals would be suppressed, and there might be a much higher bar for what we consider AI generated. If there are many bot comments in our data set that we calibrate with. So this sort of thing should hopefully be taken, should hopefully be served by this calibration, but it would be interesting to see how robust that is.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for short question. I have a short question. So you showed some manual analysis, and also I understand that you're users of Wikipedia, so you might be aware that the problem of paid editing had existed in Wikipedia for a long time, and there are some efforts to detect when someone is doing basically advertisement content on Wikipedia. What is your, like, after looking to the articles that looks to be or appears to be generated with AI, do you think that this is just basically the paid editing becoming cheaper, or you think that we are in front of a completely different problem? Like, is the problem here that we can generate advertisement very cheaply, or it's the or we're facing a completely different issue? What is, I know that this is not a technical question, it's more your opinion on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is also a philosophical question of what is advertisement? What's the point of creating? I think it's obvious right now that a lot of this content is somewhat lower in quality and more templated than what you would expect from a high quality, motivated Wikipedia contributor. I think the real risk here is it allows a couple of actors to very quickly generate a whole lot of content in a way that was not possible before, where at least it's not on first impression obvious if somebody goes through and puts in like images and links. I think one thing that we noticed quite obviously was there was a lack of links relative to a human generated article. So I think the sourcing is going to be a major issue going forward, where even if you can write something that looks human generated, it's not going to be quite as well sourced and quite as thoughtfully written as something a human would. So at the moment, I still think there's a quality difference where even if somebody is writing advertisement, it might not be as effective as a more thoughtful advertisement is. So we noticed like four main uses of these cases that are described in the paper. We are curious ourselves as to what the underlying motivation is, and I think the Wikimedia Foundation would have a very interesting eagle's eye view as to how, like, what areas are being expanded relative to past history. So that's where I would look at as changing use cases.
Yeah, I think that there's a very good point about what we consider advertising and what is knowledge. But yeah, this is a long discussion. But thank you very much. We have time for a very short question. Deborah, I understand that there's something short that we can ask from YouTube.
Yeah, this is a quick question, I think. They said, if I understood correctly, you chose as non-AI articles some articles that were not edited after early 2022. Why didn't you choose the version of articles from that same time range?
Yeah, sorry, I probably wasn't very clear, but we actually did choose like the version of those articles from that time range from a snapshot on Hugging Face. So it wasn't ones that haven't been edited since. That would certainly be a different distribution. So thank you for clarifying. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation, Chris and Dennis. It was super interesting. We invite all the audience also to read the paper. This paper was published in the WikiNLP workshop that is organized by Isaac and other colleagues in ACL every year. So, or in different conferences. But the WikiNLP workshop is a very interesting place also for you to meet next year if you're interested in, if you are doing this kind of research, also to read you're interested in learning more about this type of research. And with this, we are going to the second presentation. So we have Gordon. Gordon, please share your screen and please start your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So the work that I'm going to present here is titled The Consequences of Generative AI for Online Knowledge Communities. This is a very broad title. I think it's worth contextualizing this with respect to the last talk, that what we're really focusing on here are the consequences of unmanaged generative AI, as in AI that's out there in the world that people now have access to. What is the consequence of the emergence of these tools and their broad adoption for interest and sort of visitation, participation in online communities from more of an audience perspective? So this work is joint with two others, Dokyun Lee, who's another faculty member at Boston University, where I am located, and a PhD student, Zichen Chen. And this work was also similarly done about a year ago. We have two pieces of work that you can check out if you want to read more details. The focus of what I'm presenting today was published in Scientific Reports last year. That's the paper on the right. And then we have more of an opinion piece that was published in Communications of the ACM a couple months prior that you can similarly check out. I'll throw up these QR codes at the end of my presentation again, in case you do want to look at these. So I probably don't need to spend a lot of time making the case that online communities are important, at least not for this audience. One interesting thing to note here, you can see sort of a horse race. These are web traffic statistics as of a couple of months ago, the world's most visited websites. These three sites we're not actually studying Wikipedia in this particular paper, but we are studying Reddit. The release of ChatGPT on November 30th of 2022, and a site that used to be relatively highly ranked, which is Stack Overflow, which is now much further down the rankings into the hundreds, and it's continuing to plummet. So the motivation for our work, really, I am a management scholar. I'm in a business school. I'm an information systems professor. And so what we were thinking about and what motivated this research when we began it was this idea that people get a lot of value out of collaborating and interacting with human peers. Online knowledge communities facilitate information transfer, but also connection. And one thing we realized with the rapid adoption of ChatGPT when it was released in November of 2022, one of the most rapidly adopted pieces of technology in history, common use cases for that technology, based on surveys that were run at the time, were things where people would historically or normally have maybe thought about talking to a human peer to engage in that action. So things like brainstorming, ideation, kind of creativity tasks, writing and debugging code. You have peer programming is a very common thing for this reason. You would use case that's dominant here as well as to do a little bit of research on a topic and find out some information on a topic. Previously, you may have gone to talk to somebody else, or you may have gone somewhere like Stack Overflow, or you may have gone to Wikipedia directly in search of this information. There's sort of like some alarm bells are going off. If people start to use these tools in lieu of what they used to do before, there could be some negative consequences if unmanaged. So what are the concerns in particular that we're worried about? So there's the most obvious concern, which is the issue of hallucination with these technologies, basically plausible sounding responses that may not be at all accurate. In the context we're studying here, which is very much focused on software development and Stack Overflow, the way this manifests is that you may get code that is produced in response to your query to achieve some task where it doesn't provide obvious signs of error. So the code will run, it'll execute, and there will not be any kind of error message. But the concern is that there's actually a conceptual error in the implementation, and these are silent errors. And this is particularly concerning for non-experts or newer users. So someone who's new to a domain, they don't know what they don't know, and they sort of take it as given without verifying, and that's sort of bad in general for society if that starts happening. And then there's a secondary concern that as people stop potentially relying on online communities or peers to gather information or to collaborate, you may see other intangible negatives that derive from that are harder to measure because they manifest over longer periods of time. So online communities broadly are particularly important for junior and sort of marginal members of organizational communities to find connection and form connections. I have some earlier work that focused on Stack Overflow, looking at things like the career enhancing benefits of engaging in these communities. The sort of promotion in your career, we estimated the effect of becoming a moderator in a Stack Exchange community on your likelihood of career advancement. We do find and show positive effects of these things. So to the extent that people stop engaging in these communities, particularly sort of newer entrants and newer participants, that's going to be problematic in the longer term. So we wanted to understand the extent to which this is happening. This is just a Steve Jobs quote talking about the importance of casual collisions for innovation and sort of the importance of serendipity. That's sort of a main concern here that we're trying to see if this is going to become an issue. So to study this, we wanted to understand the extent to which people may begin to disengage from online information communities once they have ready access to sort of popular large language models in particular, where they can go for information and sort of bypass the original community that actually, in many cases, was the source of the training data that made these models and technologies possible in the first place. So we're going to focus on two particular communities here. We're looking at Stack Overflow, and we're also looking at Reddit developer communities. A big reason that we contrast or compare these two contexts is that there are some pretty notable differences between the two that have been sort of discussed in the academic literature a little bit. Stack Overflow has a historical, almost ideological focus on information exchange and the absence of sort of side commentary. So participants historically are actively discouraged from saying anything in conversational threads in response to questions that is not about the question being asked and the answer being provided. It is not a place for socialization. By contrast, Reddit has obviously no such qualms about socialization. You may obviously argue that there's a stronger social fabric on Reddit, and people go there not just for information, but also to socialize. And our contention here is that these technologies are particularly good at information transfer, though they may hallucinate sometimes. They may be less useful as a substitute for social connection, at least for the time being. You'd rather have your real friend rather than your ChatGPT friend for now. And to the extent that's true, Reddit may have more of a buffer against these effects. They may continue to maintain their draw a little bit better than Stack Overflow did with the release of ChatGPT in particular. So we're asking three questions here. So the first thing is we want to look at, in general, what's happening to participation. So we're going to measure this first by looking at the causal effect of the release of ChatGPT and its rapid adoption on web traffic volumes to Stack Overflow. We're then also going to look at question posting behavior. So this is people have technical questions they need answers to. They may not be able to find them in prior content on the community. And so they pose a new question, hoping to get an answer from an expert. We're going to show some negative effects, some stark ones. Then we're looking at heterogeneity. So essentially, where did these things happen most? So where do you see the biggest drop off in participation? And we're going to look in particular across different topics using topic tags on Stack Overflow. Everybody can tag their questions as related to, say, Python or whatever topic you like. You can have multiple tags on a given question. So we're looking at the prevalence of questions associated with different tags. We're then going to look at heterogeneity and the characteristics of the people who are remaining versus departing in terms of the age of their account on the site. And lastly, we're going to do this comparison between Stack Overflow and Reddit to compare how big these effects are between these two communities. And then as a tertiary thing, and I want to caveat this by saying this is the least well identified effect in the paper. It's very descriptive. We try to say something about what happens to the average quality of content being posted. Essentially, this is not looking at the questions. This is looking at the answers to people's questions, and then looking at the change in the probability that it is net downvoted by the community. So let's dig into this. So for the baseline effects on visitation volumes, what we do is we leverage proprietary data from SimilarWeb. Sorry, there's a typo there on Similar, on daily web traffic statistics to the top 1,000 most visited websites on the internet. We obtain this data, create time series for each of these 1,000 websites, global traffic volumes, over a period of time that brackets the release of ChatGPT to the broader public on November 30th of 2022. We have several months in the lead up to that date and several months post. The method we're going to use, basically what you can think about it as doing is we have all of these sort of 999 other websites that are not Stack Overflow, that are in theory maybe not completely unaffected. The vast majority of them are plausibly unaffected by the release of this technology. That said, there will be some mixed in there that are affected as well, potentially. But we're using all of these to create a predictive model during the period of time prior to the release of ChatGPT. We basically learn a predictive relationship between all of these 999 websites, time series of web traffic, to predict the pre-period web traffic on Stack Overflow. And then you take that predictive model into the post period and predict the counterfactual for what would have happened on Stack Overflow had ChatGPT not been released. And the delta between the predicted counterfactual and what actually happens is our estimated drop-off in traffic to the site as a result of ChatGPT's release. And what do we see? We estimate on average a 15% decline in regular web traffic as a result of ChatGPT's release. So on the left, you see the blue is what actually happened to daily web traffic over the period of study on Stack Overflow. And then the red is the predicted counterfactual of what it would have been had ChatGPT not been released. And that delta is then depicted on the right, where you see this sort of average 15% drop off over the months following the release of the technology. Okay, so volume of visitors falls. The next thing we're going to do now is look at the causal effect of ChatGPT's release on the volume of questions being posted for a given topic tag. So what we do is we construct time series weekly measures of how many questions were posted that had a particular tag. And we look at the top 50 most popular topic tags on Stack Overflow when we do this. So we're going to have 50 panels of questions by week over time. The way we're going to estimate the causal effect here, well, we don't have a control group. Essentially, ChatGPT got released. It's there everywhere globally. So we don't have a counterpoint to compare where it wasn't present. So what we actually do, we take the exact same topic tags over the exact same calendar months, bracketing the release of ChatGPT. And then for those same topic tags, we look at exactly one calendar year prior, what was happening in terms of question posting volumes for each of those topics on a week-by-week basis for the same seasonal period, but at a year earlier in absolute time. And we artificially bring that forward and line it up with the actual period when ChatGPT got released in the middle. And then we use this sort of historical counterfactual as the basis for saying, we're relying quite heavily on an assumption that there are seasonal patterns in question posting behavior on different topics within a given year. We verify that this is sort of a valid assumption in the paper, which makes sense because a lot of these topics are driven, the activity is driven by people in the workplace, for example, working on particular things. And so you see holiday effects and other stuff where questions drop off. So what we're going to do is basically estimate relative to that historical counterfactual seasonal patterns in question posting volumes, what's the average drop off per topic, and then we can explore heterogeneity across topics to see where the effects are bigger or smaller. So the average effect that we see mirrors the volume effect we showed earlier. So the drop off in people visiting the site mirrors the drop off in question posting volumes. That's probably a bit unsurprising. We estimate about a 15% decline in daily question posting volumes for the average topic. Now, this translates to about 150 fewer questions per topic week. But again, there's a lot of variation because some topics are much more popular than others, as you can imagine on the site. But what's more interesting, I think, is to think about heterogeneity across the topics on the site where the effects are bigger or smaller. So what we do is we had a hypothesis that these effects are going to be larger. They should be larger for topics where an LLM like ChatGPT had more training data available. So basically, topics that are discussed in a more prevalent way, or where there's more code examples available in GitHub repositories. So what we basically are going to do is we're going to try and correlate the magnitude of these effects with how much available training data was there out there for that particular topic prior to the release of ChatGPT. And we proxy for available training data in two ways. So we're going to look at the volume of GitHub repositories that incorporate code of a particular type. So that's going to be based specifically on code topics, particular languages. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the volume of relevant subreddits on Reddit that deal with that topic, the subscribership to subreddits that are focused on those topics. We use the exact same estimation strategy, but what we're going to do is we're going to re-estimate the model I described in the last slide, but we're just going to do it topic by topic now, and then compare the magnitudes of the effects across topics. And what we see is sort of a rough correlation between available training data and the magnitude of effects. So Python is by far the most heavily impacted topic. It's also, along with JavaScript, has some of the most prevalent training data available. So it's not surprising the model would be good at Python. Some more edge case topics, you see much smaller effects. So things that are more proprietary frameworks and things where there's less public code available, we see much smaller magnitude effects, unsurprisingly. And this is almost sort of a sanity check. It's what you would expect to see. And then maybe the most interesting thing here is thinking about which users are being affected the most. So the way we get at this, we're looking at average changes in the average characteristics of the accounts that are participating in the community before versus after the release of ChatGPT. If this average characteristics shift causally as a result of ChatGPT's release, then the inference is the average is changing because people are selecting out of the community, which seems more plausible than people selecting in to the community as a result of these tools being available. I want to caveat that by saying at the time this was released, the dominant use case, I think, was replacing Stack Overflow information with stuff from ChatGPT. The dynamic could be a little bit different on other sites, like, say, Wikipedia, where it's using the information from Wikipedia as a source to respond to an answer and even providing a link a lot of the time. So you may still see traffic flowing through ChatGPT to Wikipedia. So the context is a little different. That's worth bearing in mind. So what do we find when we do our estimation? We basically find a systematic increase in the average age of the account posting questions on the site. What is the implication? It means there's a systematic exit of newer user accounts. So any given question being posted or the body of questions being posted to Stack Overflow over time, it becomes increasingly likely that the people that are posting are established accounts and not new ones. The implication here is that newer users are systematically becoming less and less likely to ever arrive at Stack Overflow and post anything or ask any questions, which means they're not engaging at the outset, okay? Which has maybe longer term consequences that may be concerning, that you don't get the new, so you don't get the turnover, you don't get the new participants starting out. And the last thing I'll mention in the last couple of minutes here is we repeat some of these analyses using data from Reddit. The data that we use from Reddit, instead of looking at panels of question volumes by topic tag, what we're going to look at is posting volumes by subreddit. And we matched subreddits based on their focus to topic tags on Stack Overflow. So we're finding developer subreddits that are focused on particular languages or frameworks on Reddit. And we use the exact same estimation strategy so we can directly compare, and the effects are sort of relative effects, so we can directly compare the magnitudes as well. Not particularly important that I say that, though, because essentially what we find is there's absolutely no effect on Reddit. We see no evidence whatsoever that there was a decline in participation in any Reddit communities as a result of ChatGPT's release. We attribute this, again, as I said earlier at the outset, to the fact that Reddit one big difference is it is a more of a place for social interaction and socialization, certainly in comparison to Stack Overflow. We find that there's a zero effect on average across all topics or across all subreddits that we look at. And then also, if you look subreddit by subreddit, we're finding null effects in almost every case as well. So no evidence of any consequence. And then the last thing I mentioned, this is again the least well identified effect, so I wouldn't hang my hat on this result because there's a couple degrees of separation from ChatGPT's release to people participating into the community to the hypothesized mechanism here is as fewer people participate, you are less likely to get these long tail solutions where this is, a person who they don't have any information to answer almost any question on the site, but it just so happens they see a question posed where they're the one person who's ever encountered that and dealt with it. Our expectation is as you lose these margin participants, you're less likely to get these sort of extreme value solutions that come out of the tail, and you may see a drop off in the probability of getting a high quality answer to any given question. Of course, the other reason I would be concerned about interpreting this the wrong way is that the other reason you might see an average decline in the quality of answers is that the questions may get systematically harder. And that's because the newer users are not coming. So the questions that do arrive are more likely to be coming from experts who are having a hard time, and therefore the questions may be harder to answer in the first place. And that could be another explanation why the average quality of responses is dropping. So just to be clear, there's a couple reasons we may see a consequence here or a result. So it's more difficult to interpret what we find. And what we do find is that it's not as stark of a discontinuity, but we do find an average increase over time in the probability that any given answer to a question that's posed on Stack Overflow, there's an increased probability that it will be net downvoted. That is, it receives more downvotes than upvotes. Okay. And the reason we focus on the net probability the probability of net downvote rather than the count or the net vote in general is that as you see changes in the magnitude of participants in the audience on the site, you'll see changes in the vote volumes as well. They'll regress towards zero. So we focus just on is the net of the upvote, downvote negative or not in this analysis. So it does look like quality is quote unquote getting worse on average, but again, it may also just be reflecting that the questions are getting systematically harder. I will stop there. We have a couple other results that are tied to demonstrating actually an increase in the average complexity of the questions being posted, which we attribute to the exit of newer users that have simpler questions. But I'll stop there. Please feel free to check out the paper if you want to know more. And I'm happy to take questions from the audience.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Gordon, for a super interesting presentation. I think we have some questions from YouTube, so we can start with them. Deborah?
All right. Yeah, so we have some comments on YouTube, so I'll relay those to get your thoughts on those. The first is that someone wondered how much web search would be shown to disengage users from knowledge sharing under this method. I asked them a clarifying question to ask whether they meant that they wondered whether users are going to Stack Overflow less because they're searching and finding answers to their questions from a search engine instead, and that I suspected a lot of Stack Overflow visits come from clicking a result from a web search. And then they said that if they didn't have web search, presumably a lot more duplicate questions would be posted, and similarly on Reddit. So yeah, any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I think it is true that the vast majority of traffic to Stack Overflow was basically Google driven. That mechanism or the role of web search is something that our research design kind of accounts for. So it should play a homogeneous role over time, over a whole window of study. So the discontinuity we're seeing wouldn't be explained by the availability of web search. I think the other thing that's worth noting is that Stack Overflow has subsequently introduced some AI models that are focused on pre-identifying that a question being posed is a redundant question and encouraging somebody to go look at other questions that have been provided already if it detects that it's too similar. That didn't happen in concert with the thing we're studying here. It happened later, but that would also contribute. It's probably making things even sort of magnitude-wise bigger in terms of the effect I show here. They would get larger later in time.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's another comment from the YouTube chat that someone said, I believe the voting system on Stack Overflow also helps with this, as duplicate questions are often downvoted a lot, or questions that might be slightly similar sometimes. And then they also added kind of just overall comment of how it's really interesting to think of how the community will react to answers involving AI generated code or those that look like it.
Yes, and there's something to talk about there as well. I didn't study it here, but Stack Overflow officially banned the use of AI tools for generating answers on the site at some point, but enforcement is largely impossible because I guess that at least up to this point, they didn't have great ways of detecting AI use. Maybe the prior paper provides a better means of doing that. So it was more just a standing policy more than anything else.
Thank you, Gordon. I have a question. Again, it's more about how you see the future, because there are experiments that show that a lot of things that are on the web is usually not that the LLMs understands new problems, but they are very good like an advanced search engine. So you have a problem that the solution is already in Stack Overflow, or the answer is in Reddit. I'm instead of going to Reddit, the LLM would produce this as a new answer generated by that pretendly smart language model that is basically predicting the next character. But what happened with content that is new? So we have you go to Stack Overflow and it's full of Python, it's full of C. But what happened if a new language becomes popular? How you see the future? You showed that plot with ChatGPT like reaching the same numbers than Instagram in 20 days, in 70 days, I don't remember, and ChatGPT in 5 days. But it's because it's basically it's replacing somehow the way that people search. But what happened with the new content that exists there? Do you have a sense of, or do like you saw the decrease on newcomers in these platforms? Yeah, what will happen with the new knowledge that is created?
So, I mean, it's a good point, right? Like, if you think about the loop of knowledge production and then consumption by these models for sort of regurgitation, they're self-defeating in the long run if they don't create some sustainable loop. Because if you break people's engagement in these communities that provide all this training data for the models, and sort of keep them housed within sort of the LLMs platform, then the new content isn't being produced that the models can then be trained on and learn from to maintain their currency. I do think you're specifically saying, like, what if things change and this training data that was used to create these models sort of ages and becomes less relevant to the newer things that are being requested. I think this is probably part of why you're seeing these companies forming licensing arrangements with lots of content platforms, because they realize they need more data, but they also need current data. And they're worried about lawsuits and things, of course. But if we have content licensing agreements, not just with journalistic outlets, but also like with Reddit or with Stack Overflow, you maintain current content that way. And I think there needs to be a more harmonious relationship. It's like, so proper attribution is a difficult thing, but it's an important thing for not just for legal reasons, but also for like maintaining this positive feedback loop where content is being produced and fed back into the system. All of this depends on them sort of properly attributing knowledge to these communities and then directing people to go read more in the community. I think that's something that's in the interest of the LLM platforms to be doing that. And I think it's occurring to various degrees.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And here with Wikipedia, we're also very interested in that. Deborah, you have another question from YouTube.
Yeah, so there was another comment on YouTube about how there's an essay or presentation called "The Fall of Stack Overflow is Not Because of ChatGPT," which argues that the moderation policies are the real culprit. So I guess are you
I'm
aware
aware
of
of this.
that essay, and do you have thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, so so the broader context here, Stack Overflow's user engagement was falling prior to the release of ChatGPT. So what I will say is I encourage people to read the paper. Our paper is one of there's like 2 or 3 other papers in other disciplines that have shown similar results. Basically, this accelerated what was happening a lot. So it was starting to degrade, maybe due to their moderation policies and the way they were running the site. But we see sort of discontinuous drop off as a result of this tool coming out. So stacking on what was happening already.
Thank you. Yeah, I chatted with my husband about this paper because he's a software engineer, and I asked him like whether he, his Stack Overflow usage has gone down because I know he uses LLMs a lot for his coding questions. And what he had told me lines up with what you just said, that he said his Stack Overflow usage has definitely gone down since he's been using ChatGPT, but that he felt like it had been going down before then for reasons he couldn't quite pinpoint, but for reasons of finding the Stack Overflow not as useful even before that. So anyway, I'm curious whether, if you've heard that, have you heard other feedback from other software developers kind of
So as an as an academic who writes a fair amount of code for research, like I know certainly in the academic community, everybody is basically relying to some extent on LLM code completion tools, whether it's through Cursor or just dropping stuff into ChatGPT. Private companies have their own models that they are providing. Large digital organizations have their own LLM code completion tools that support coding exercises. So there's a lot less requirement to go to the site to look up technical solutions. Yeah, it's definitely happening.
Thank you, Jordan. We have the last question, and then we can open the discussion for all the presenters and also to wrap up a bit. But Isaac, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Diego, and thank you, Gordon, for the talk. Yeah, my question, I was curious, and I know this is outside the scope of your work, but I wanted to hear you maybe, and I guess this gets to what was just being discussed, but kind of qualitatively, if you get a sense of what's been going on with Stack Overflow, like is it kind of a more niche community now and a little bit smaller, but still like, functionally can answer lots of questions and very useful for folks and has engagement? Or is it, has this really kind of contributed to a broader, like, these kind of, clearing out of the community and downturn?
And again, this is my perception, qualitatively, is that I think they're in a little bit of crisis mode. A lot of what's going on was basically this happened and blindsided the community, I think, and they've been trying to figure out how to adapt. So how to incorporate AI into the platform, how to sort of maintain sort of the value of the platform in light of what's possible now from these third-party LLM tools. And I don't know that they've quite been able to figure it out. And I think a big part of what the challenge is that a huge part of the problem is inbound traffic is not happening as much as it used to. And the network effect, is starting to degrade and the community unravels a little bit. Like even if the experts are there and they're still enjoying the community, if they don't have an audience anymore, you kind of lose motivation for being there and participating and answering stuff. And so I think that's hard to overcome. My sense qualitatively, my perception is that things are still getting worse. It's still going down even now.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I would like to use these last 4 minutes that we have to give you the opportunity to the three presenters to discuss a bit more about the implications of this. And it caught my attention, and I use this as a trigger, but you can wrap up also with our stuff. But in some point, Gordon, you mentioned that Stack Overflow was forbidden the usage of generated content, but they have no way to measure that. On the other hand, the paper about Wikipedia trying to estimate what is the amount of content generated with AI. And my perception on this is that we're putting a lot of attention in the tool that is being used, and probably the most important thing is the content. So it's maybe not what important it is, what tool was used for doing something. So people was using before Grammarly to fix stuff. We that are not native speakers of English, we use a lot of tools to try to improve our grammar and stuff like that. and that's not a problem. The problem is focusing the content. But we know that the generative AI generates this long text sometimes that brings other problems. But how do you see the future in general of platforms trying to somehow fight against generative AI, or the focus should be put more into the consequence of this, try to fight the disinformation generated, try to fight the advertisement content, or try to fight the problems that we were discussing before about, like, Stack Overflow not producing new knowledge, and that new knowledge won't be produced anymore. So what are your thoughts in terms of where we should put our attention in, like preventing the tool or preventing other stuff, and which would be this other stuff that we should prevent? And this is Gordon, if you want to start, or Dennis, Kristen, whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, I can start. So our CACM paper that I linked to, we spend a lot of time talking about, like, what should we do about this? I think the tools are there, and I think trying to detect and block is a lost cause. And we have this conversation actually quite actively in the academic community about the peer review process and people using these tools in peer review. And if I'm just pasting someone's like paper into an LLM and it spits out a review and I just paste it back into the system, like, why am I here? And you can tell sometimes it's obvious because it's really low quality, but ultimately what's the real problem? It's exactly what you said, Diego. It's what's happening to the quality of the content. And so I agree. I don't think the goal here should be blocking usage. I think the goal should be managing usage. And this is a design problem about, it's like market mechanism design. It's about creating the right incentives. It is about creating mechanisms of validation and peer review such that it's natural and people want to do it. And it's hard. It means either creating some positive incentive to using it properly and doing a good job and verifying that it's right before you post it. And it also means creating costs to not doing that. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about when it comes to platform management, is how to better incentivize people to seek out a human peer review on the AI content before you post it, or creating some incentive to doing the organic thing without the AI's help. Like, so that's my view. I think that's probably the best path forward.
Thank you, Gordon. Dennis, Kristen, you're still around. You want to intervene? Okay, I think you're not connected right now. So I think with this, and we are over time, so we can close. We will thank our speakers again, and I would pass to Kinner to close the session.
Thanks, Diego. And thank you everyone in the audience who joined us today for the showcase and participated in today's discussion. I especially want to thank our speakers, Dennis, Kristen, and Gordon, once again for their contributions. The Wikimedia Research Showcase is also made possible thanks to a great coordination team. So thank you, Eli, Diego, and Deborah for the help in organizing this. Once again, we won't have a showcase in August as we will be focused on Wikimania. We hope to see you there and back here for another research showcase in September. Thanks, everyone. Okay, and we're back and we're no longer